Welcome to Learning with Mr. Ruck. I'm Mr. Ruck Dashel, and this is part 3. Welcome back. Part 3 of learning about life during the Civil War and really how terrible it was, no matter what you did. So, buckle up tight, because we are sure to hear some crazy, sad stories. And in this story, this is the beginning now of one of my favorite parts of this section, to where we really get to hear a firsthand account of Reverend Macaulay and his changes that occurred in his town of Chattanooga. Let's history. During the year 1863, the times grew more appalling. Soldiers were in the city more plentiful than ever. After the Battle of Murfreesboro, this city became a veritable storm center. Bragg, a general in the Confederate Army, fell back and had his headquarters here. Our house soon became almost a hotel. Our house, during the winter of 1862 and 63, was not only a hotel, but a hospital. About 9 p.m., the train came down from Knoxville on the way to the front. The poor fellows, on a cold night, and nearly all nights were cold then, would begin to knock at our door about 9:30 p.m., asking to be allowed only to lie on the floor rather than out of doors. We never turned away any, as long as there was room, with every bed occupied in the house. The floors of the hall and dining room could be covered with the bodies of these fellows, rejoicing with the privilege of being in out of the rain and wind and cold. The next night, the same thing was repeated. This went right on during the winter months. On August 25th, 1863, Reverend Macaulay tells what happened on a Friday night at the church service. The church was crowded with civilians and citizens and Confederate soldiers. Dr. Palmer arose to pray, the audience rising with him and standing. Scarcely had he begun to pray till the scream of a shell flying over the church was heard, and the distant boom of a cannon from the opposite side of the Tennessee River. In a moment, another shell screaming and another cannon booming. The soldiers began quietly to withdraw, then the citizens, till presently the church was empty, and still the preacher prayed. When he closed his eyes, the church was full of people. When he opened them, it was on empty pews. The Union Army, on the opposite side of the bank of the Tennessee, had planted their artillery, and without a word of warning, were shelling the city. Everything was in a commotion. The excitement was deep. Citizens were leaving on every train, going south, and the very air seemed surcharged with the electric flashes of a coming storm. Great and powerful forces of the Northern Army were hemming Chattanooga in on every side, and it was not known where and when the thunderbolt would fall. We knew not when these dark days had in reserve for those. We took such precautions for safety and the preservation of life as we could. I cut and fitted false doors in the top of one of my wardrobes upstairs and made a way into the attic. There, with the assistance of my family, I carried our coffee, our bacon, and a little cornmeal, and a little flour. This was done to keep the Federal soldiers from coming in and stealing everything we had to eat. With fear and trembling, we looked forward to the capture of Chattanooga by a victorious army that counted those of us that were here as nothing but rebels. In other words, he's saying that just like we heard from the black soldier earlier that was on the Confederate side, they were hoping that their town would get taken. Wild. At length came the fatal day. The 9th of September, 1863, the Confederate cavalry withdrew about 9 o'clock in the morning, and about 10 a.m., streams of Union soldiers, the first we had seen, dressed in blue, came pouring in. Not a child was harmed, not a woman insulted, not a man was killed, but here was a peaceable occupation of a city without any violence or outrage of any kind. The Union Army was not in the city many days till we observed a very decided difference. between these two peoples and the two armies. The Confederate soldiers were far more polite than the Union. The Confederates would come in at the front gate, knock at the front door, lift his hat to the lady, and went forward to meet him. And even to the servant he would speak politely. But the Union soldiers would cross the fence wherever he struck it, and would come in at the back door, and the first you know of him, he would be standing before you. Say, in the kitchen, without a bow or so much as a good morning. There was a rough and ready rudeness about him that seemed to be as inborn as politeness in the other. Another difference that we noted was in the industry and obedience in the Union Army, surpassing in both these respects decidedly the Confederate. In other words, they're saying that like the Union soldiers, the Union Army, obeys orders and is much more works harder. The Confederate soldier did not like to work, neither was he as obedient to the discipline he should have been. The Union soldier threw up breastworks, built bridges, felled trees, and wrought prodigiously with his hands for the attainment of his ends. This was the biggest element in his makeup. He moved like an army. He drilled with the precision and regularity of a clock. We soon perceived that there was strength and tremendous strength in the Northern Army. Another difference that we soon found out, that to our dismay, was that while the Confederate soldiers respected private property and would not take a shoestring without asking for it, the Union soldier thought everything belonged to him. Our garden and yard fences went down for the purpose of making barracks for the men. Our little mule named Pete we brought and put in the smokehouse that stood right close in the yard. Even he was stolen and only with difficulty recovered. Our large stable, cowhouse, and corn crib all went. The quartermaster drove up his wagons and with a lot of his hands tore them down and carried them off. Away went our turkeys too. Even our cows were driven off and disappeared. By and by, when the last picket was pulled from the fence, the last outhouse swept away, the last chicken, turkey, and cow gone, and our edifice was left, standing alone, as in a desert, we felt a sense of relief and rest. A kind of providence was watching over us, never suffered of them to enter our dwelling as a marauder. Okay, so obviously the townspeople are a little bit fearful. For obvious reasons. They have a new army here. And even before they had this new army, they had an army that they wanted out. They admitted to wanting out. Now, obviously, this town of Chattanooga will change because of this occupation, because now everything that surrounded this house, they said his edifice is gone. So he had outhouses to where, he would keep the cows and chickens and livestock. But now those things are gone. And that's why he said he felt like his house was sitting in the middle of a desert. It was alone. And it's pretty apparent that this is because the Union Army has no intention of leaving this town, just like the Confederates did. And there were obvious differences in the Confederate and Union Army that showed why that would happen. The Union Army was a bunch of hardworking, although rude, soldiers, while the Confederate was polite, but they made it sound like they were lazy or didn't have much drive to do anything to defend the town. I'm curious why that was. Well, hopefully in part 3, we're almost there to part 4, the conclusion. Hopefully in part 3 today, you've learned a little bit as far as what it would have been like to where your allegiances could change like that. Not only allegiance by your town being occupied by someone else, but even before that happened, there are times where you're hoping that whatever happens, your town gets taken by the other side. I keep saying it. I keep repeating myself, but I'm going to say it again. It's a wild time. All right. It's been Mr. Ruckdashel. We'll see you next time. Like, share, subscribe. Peace.